For as long as humans have told stories, the idea of crossing humans with animals has appeared again and again. From ancient mythological creatures on cave walls, to mythical hybrids like Minotaur, to modern internet rumors, hybrid beings sit at the intersection of curiosity, fear, and fascination. The appeal is not difficult to understand. Humans and other animals, especially other ape species, share biological similarities. And with the rise of modern genetics, those similarities have become quantifiable rather than symbolic. Humans and chimpanzees, for example, share roughly 98 to 99% of their protein-coding DNA. This genetic closeness has repeatedly led to speculation, both scientific and popular, about whether a hybrid might be possible. In recent years, viral stories about supposed cross-species pregnancies or laboratory-created chimeras have reignited these debates, even when the claims themselves turned out to be false or misunderstood. Hybridization itself is not a fringe concept. Humans have been intentionally crossing animal species for thousands of years. In ancient Mesopotamia, the kunga, a hybrid of donkey and Syrian wild ass, was a prized status symbol. The mule, a donkey-horse hybrid, became one of the most economically important animals in human history due to its strength and resilience. More recently, scientific hybridization has produced both successes and disasters, from robust agricultural breeds to ecological catastrophes such as Africanized honeybees. But while animal hybridization is often accepted, sometimes even celebrated, the idea of mixing humans with other species provokes a far deeper discomfort. That unease is not merely scientific, it is moral, cultural, and philosophical. Where exactly does humanity draw the line between experimentation and transgression? In the early 20th century, as often, one scientist attempted to push directly through that line. His name was Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov. Unlike mythmakers or conspiracy theorists, Ivanov was a highly respected biologist, internationally known for his pioneering work in artificial insemination. His experiments were not secret fantasies. They were funded, documented, and, at least for a time, supported by major scientific institutions. What makes Ivanov's story so disturbing is not that it failed. It is that it nearly proceeded much further than many people realize, under the authority of a state convinced that science could, and should, reshape humanity itself, an idea that's becoming more and more present through technological progress. Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was born in 1870 in the Russian Empire. He was trained as a biologist and physiologist and became a professor by 1907. At the turn of the century, Ivanov revolutionized animal breeding. His work demonstrated that a single stallion, through artificial insemination, could fertilize up to 500 mares, compared to roughly 20 to 30 through natural breeding. This was a dramatic leap in efficiency and had major implications for agriculture, livestock quality, and food production. Breeders from across Europe and beyond visited his facilities to observe his methods firsthand. Ivanov did not limit his work to horses. He expanded his experiments to cattle, sheep, and other domesticated animals, and soon began experimenting with interspecies hybridization. Some of these attempts were successful. He produced hybrids such as zebra-donkey crosses and bison-cow hybrids, contributing to a broader scientific effort to understand heredity, reproduction, and species boundaries. But you can already see where this is going. By 1910, Ivanov's ambitions had grown beyond farm animals. At the World Congress of Zoologists in Graz, Austria, he publicly raised a provocative idea. If closely related animal species could be hybridized, might it be theoretically possible to hybridize humans and other great apes using artificial insemination? At the time, this was presented as a speculative question rather than an immediate research plan. But it was taken seriously enough to be discussed in academic circles. Crucially, this idea did not emerge in isolation. Early 20th century biology was deeply shaped by Darwinian evolution, debates over heredity, and growing confidence in scientific intervention. Many scientists believed that nature's limits could be tested, mapped, and ultimately controlled. Ivanov was very much a product of that intellectual climate. What changed everything was politics. The Russian Revolution of 1917 destroyed the old imperial system and replaced it with a radically new state ideology. Science was no longer just a tool for knowledge. And you might think Ivanov, as part of the imperial scientific system, would be cast away. But the new regime had a different take on science. It became a weapon in a broader struggle against religion, tradition, and the old social order. In this new environment, ideas that once seemed ethically unthinkable began to look ideologically useful. And Ivanov, with his expertise and his willingness to push biological boundaries, suddenly found himself at the center of a much larger experiment. After the Russian Civil War, the newly formed Union of Soviet Socialist Republics emerged as a one-party state under Bolshevik rule. The regime viewed science as a strategic instrument, a means to modernize the country, legitimize Marxist ideology, and weaken religious belief. Scientific theories that challenged the authority of the church, particularly evolutionary biology, were actively encouraged. Within this context, Ivanov's earlier speculation about human-ape hybridization took on a new political meaning. If humans could be shown to be biologically continuous with animals, it would strike directly at religious doctrines of human uniqueness and divine creation. For Soviet leaders, this was not a philosophical curiosity. It was ideological ammunition. In 1924, Ivanov formally requested government funding to pursue experiments aimed at hybridizing humans and non-human apes through artificial insemination. And that's exactly what he got. In 1925, the Soviet Academy of Sciences approved funding of approximately $10,000, an enormous sum at the time, to support Ivanov's work. It is important to be precise here. There is no reliable archival evidence that Joseph Stalin personally ordered the creation of an ape-man army. Claims that Stalin envisioned super soldiers, insensitive to pain, largely originate from later newspaper reports and secondary retellings, often without verifiable documentation. What is clear, however, is that the Soviet leadership knew of Ivanov's project, approved its funding, and saw potential ideological value in its success. And more surprisingly, with government backing secured, Ivanov also obtained permission from the Institut Pasteur in Paris to work at its primate research station in French Guiana. The Pasteur Institute did not finance the experiment, but it granted Ivanov access to its facilities and animals. By 1926, Ivanov was preparing for an expedition to West Africa. His official mission was framed as scientific research into primate reproduction. In practice, he intended to attempt something unprecedented: the artificial insemination of female chimpanzees using human sperm. The experiment was about to move from speculation to action. In 1926, Ilya Ivanov arrived in French Guiana, beginning the most infamous phase of his career. Almost immediately, the project ran into serious problems. The primate station Ivanov was meant to use was poorly managed and suffered from an exceptionally high mortality rate among its animals. More critically, Ivanov discovered that most of the chimpanzees available to him were not sexually mature. Local hunters supplied the station by killing adult chimpanzees and capturing infants, meaning the animals were years away from reproductive age. After months of difficulty, Ivanov managed to obtain several adult female chimpanzees. In late 1926 and early 1927, he proceeded to artificially inseminate 3 female chimps with human sperm. These procedures were carried out under chaotic and improvised conditions, without proper laboratory controls. Ivanov later admitted in his personal notes that he feared local staff would react violently if they understood the true nature of the experiments. To avoid suspicion, he disguised the procedures as medical treatments. The inseminations were physically violent and dangerous, both for the animals and the people involved. One chimpanzee attacked Ivanov's son, who was assisting him, inflicting injuries severe enough to require hospitalization. Despite multiple attempts, none of the chimpanzees became pregnant. Facing failure, Ivanov considered an alternative approach, one even more ethically disturbing. Rather than inseminating chimpanzees with human sperm, he proposed inseminating human women with chimpanzee sperm. Evidence suggests he initially planned to do so without the women's informed consent, believing it would be easier than handling aggressive animals. Ivanov discussed this plan with local physicians, some of whom appeared open to the idea. However, the French colonial governor intervened and explicitly forbade any such experiments. With no pregnancies achieved and mounting scrutiny from both colonial authorities and scientific institutions, Ivanov was forced to abandon his work in Africa. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1927, bringing several chimpanzees with him. Many died during transport. Ivanov, however, had not abandoned his objective. He believed the African failure was logistical, not scientific, and he intended to continue his work on Soviet soil. Back in the Soviet Union, Ivanov relocated his work to a newly established primate facility in Sukhumi, in the Caucasus region. Unlike in French Guinea, Ivanov now operated within a state that openly encouraged radical scientific experimentation. Under the auspices of the Communist Academy, which rivaled the more conservative Academy of Sciences, Ivanov found renewed institutional support. The Communist Academy viewed his project as compatible with eugenic thinking and Marxist ideas. One crucial condition was imposed. Any human participants had to be volunteers. Contrary to later assumptions, Ivanov did not struggle to find them. By March 1928, he had received letters from several women, at least 5, expressing their willingness to participate in the experiment. At the same time, the practical foundations of the project began to collapse. Of the chimpanzees Ivanov brought from Africa, only 4 survived long enough to reach maturity. Eventually, only one adult male remained, a 26-year-old orangutan named Tarzan. Before any insemination could take place, Tarzan suffered a fatal brain hemorrhage. While Ivanov waited for new primates to arrive, his position became increasingly precarious. Soviet authorities learned of his earlier attempts in Africa to inseminate women without consent, triggering outrage even within a system known for, well, let's call that ethical flexibility. The Academy of Sciences formally withdrew its support, warning that Ivanov's actions risked damaging Soviet scientific credibility abroad. The political climate worsened rapidly. By 1929, Stalin's consolidation of power had initiated widespread purges, targeting individuals associated with the old imperial elite. Ivanov, trained under the Tsarist system and increasingly isolated, became vulnerable. In December 1930, he was arrested by the Soviet secret police, accused of participating in counter-revolutionary activity, most likely an excuse. Ivanov was sentenced to 5 years of exile in Kazakhstan, where he continued working as a veterinary researcher under strict supervision. He died in 1932 from a stroke, never having carried out his final planned experiment. No human-ape hybrid was ever created. The project ended not with a scientific breakthrough, but with political disgrace, institutional silence, and death. After Ivanov's death, his work faded from public view, only to re-emerge decades later wrapped in rumor, exaggeration, and ideological reinterpretation. The most persistent claim is that Joseph Stalin sought to create an army of human-ape super-soldiers, beings stronger than humans, insensitive to pain, obedient, and easy to sustain. This image, often compared to Planet of the Apes, is compelling, but it is not supported by primary evidence. Archival records confirm that Ivanov's experiments were state-funded and ideologically tolerated, but they do not demonstrate a direct military objective. No operational plans, military directives, or Red Army involvement have been found. Historians broadly agree that the eight-man army narrative emerged later, amplified by Cold War journalism, sensationalist reporting, and ideological agendas on both sides of the Iron Curtain. What is supported by the evidence, though, is more subtle and arguably more disturbing. One likely motivation was anti-religious propaganda. The Bolshevik leadership viewed religion as a foundational pillar of the old social order. Demonstrating a biological continuity between humans and animals, especially through a hybrid, would have symbolically undermined creationist beliefs and reinforced Marxist materialism. Ivanov himself framed his work in evolutionary terms when presenting it to Soviet institutions. Another motivation lies in early Soviet eugenics, particularly what historians call positive eugenics. Unlike Nazi racial policy, which focused on producing the perfect Aryans, sterilizing and excluding the others, Soviet eugenicists in the 1920s explored how science might actively shape a new socialist human. I let you interpret this vague claim as you wish to. Ivanov's work fit neatly into this framework. Even if he personally viewed the experiment as a scientific challenge rather than a political act, those who funded him likely saw broader implications. His experiment suggested that humanity itself was malleable, subject to intervention, optimization, and redesign. Later claims of successful hybrids, whether in the Soviet Union, China, or the United States, remain unsubstantiated. Reports of pregnancies, surviving hybrids, or escaped subjects have consistently failed under scrutiny. Modern biological research has shown that while human sperm can sometimes penetrate the outer layers of ape eggs, stable fertilization and embryonic development do not occur. Ilya Ivanov's attempt to create a human-ape hybrid occupies a unique and unsettling place in the history of science. It was not a myth, not a secret military project, and not the work of an isolated madman. It was a state-funded scientific effort carried out by a respected biologist, supported, at least temporarily, by major institutions, and embedded in a political culture that believed nature itself could be reshaped. The failure of Ivanov's experiments did not end the ethical questions they raised. Throughout the 20th century and into the present, science has continued to blur the boundary between humans and other animals. Today, laboratories create human-animal chimeras by inserting human cells into animal embryos, primarily to study disease or grow transplantable organs. These embryos are destroyed before developing nervous systems, but the underlying principle, biological mixing across species, remains. What distinguishes Ivanov's work is not merely its goal, but its absence of safeguards. His willingness to deceive, to proceed without informed consent, and to subordinate ethics to ambition exposed how easily scientific authority can override human and animal welfare when reinforced by ideology. The discomfort surrounding human-animal hybrids is not solely about biology. Humans routinely accept hybrids in plants and animals, and we now know that modern humans interbred with other hominins, such as Neanderthals and Denisovans. This knowledge provokes little moral panic. The reaction changes only when the boundary crosses into the present human identity itself. Ivanov's experiment forced an unspoken question into the open. If humans are biologically continuous with the rest of the animal kingdom, where, if anywhere, should science stop? The Soviet state answered that question with ideology. Ivanov answered it with obsession. History answered it with failure. His work did not produce a hybrid, an army, or a proof of evolution. Instead, it revealed how dangerous the combination of political certainty, scientific prestige, and ethical disregard can be. That, more than any myth of ape men or secret super soldiers, is the real legacy of Ilya Ivanov. If you found this story useful, unsettling, or worth examining more closely, consider subscribing for future deep dives into the history of science, power, and ideology. You can also like the video to help it reach a wider audience, and leave a comment with your thoughts, especially where you think the ethical line should be drawn when science and military pushes against human identity itself.